All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Josh and Becca Friedman, in honor of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda, Ben Harav Chaim Rafael Zichron Livracha, as well as for an aliyah for the neshamas of all of those who were murdered al Kiddush Hashem on Shmini Atzeres, a safe return of all of our hostages and chayalim, and the full and complete and total refuah shalem Meretz Hashem for all of those who were injured. Samuel Malka Esterson in memory of their parents Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, Yitzchak Leib Ben Aaron HaKohen, and Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram. The Pepper family, in memory of their brother and uncle, Yosef Pepper, Yosef David Ben Yaakov. And our week of learning sponsors, Dr. Ed and Faith Wolf, in honor of the marriage of their children, Gideon and Mali. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Shani Topper and family, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shani's father, Josh Gutman, Yoshua Ben Yitzchak, Zichron Livracha. And of course, we dedicate our entire Maseches Bava Kamma, Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Elio Michal Charush, who died al Kiddush Hashem by the firefight in the police station in Sderot. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, all of the families in Kamma, and of course today an overwhelming day for Klal Yisrael with Meretz Hashem, the release of the first of the 13 hostages. We hope that in Meretz Hashem they will be zochet to be reunited, at least with their people, with their land, with their family. Meretz Hashem, B'karov. All right, Debo say, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, a really great daf ahead of us. Okay, we are beginning. Today's daf is Chaf Beis 22, but we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on 21b at the Mishnah. So a really great Mishnah. Mishnah says as follows: Hakelev v'hagidi. So you have a dog and a goat. A dog and a goat, shekaftu meirosh hagag, who jumped off the roof. So they're situated on the roof, they jump off the roof, v'shavru hasakelim. And when they come down, they land on utensils and they break the utensils. So what's the halacha? Mishalim nezek shalim. Ultimately, again, they pay full damages. They pay full damages. Now, bepashtos, this is another example of regel. That's Bepashas, right? It's not Shane. It's not Shane because there's no Hana. And it's not Karen because, remember, again, there's not an intention to damage over here. So Bepashas, what we have over here is another case of Regel. So let's remember again, because remember, Regel is Muad from the beginning. Good. So the Gemara says, Hakelev Shinatal Charara. We actually saw this case before. I'm sorry. So ultimately they pay full damages because again they are muad because regel is fully obligated from the beginning. Good. Next, hakelev shenatal charara. If you have a dog that took a charara is a biscuit. And what happens? V'halach legadish, took the biscuit to a field. Now again, the unwritten part of the Mishnah, which we actually started before, was what? There's a coal attached to the bottom of the biscuit. So now the dog took the biscuit, took it to a field. So just to illustrate this, so Ruvain's dog took the biscuit with the coal on the bottom, goes to Shimon's field, places the biscuit down on a pile of wheat. And then what happens? Obviously eats the biscuit, but the coal causes a fire. So what's the halacha? The halacha is, so achal hacharari, dog ate the biscuit, vehidlik hagadish, and ignited the haystack or the field. So what's the halacha? Al hacharara mishalim nezek shalim. For the biscuit, you pay full damages. Why? What's consumption of the biscuit is? Shame. Right, biscuit, consumption of the biscuit is hana, right, it's eating the biscuit, that's called shame, right, so therefore you pay full damages for the biscuit, valagadish mishalim chatzi nezek, and ultimately again for the field, you'll pay half damages. Now let's say now what's that? What's the field case? So again, we're going to see, there's really two possibilities. Possibility one is, it's Karen, and Karen Tam pays chatzi nezek. The other possibility we'll see is maybe depending on how we construct it, it's a case of tzroros. And tzroros is also going to be chatzi nezek. Okay, so let's analyze. So we'll say, let's start first with the first case in the Mishnah. The Gemara says, Taima de kafzu. Now here's what's interesting. So case number one in the Mishnah was, you have a dog, you have a goat, and they're jumping off the roof. They land on utensils, they break the utensils. What's the halacha? Nezek shalim. Complete damages. Why? We call that regel. We call that regel. So the Gemara says, time of the kafzu. The reason ultimately why they're chayiv is because they jumped. hanaflu. What happens if the animals didn't jump around? They fell off the roof. It fell off the roof. So my dog is on a roof. My dog is on a roof, right? And it falls off and it lands on Ruvain's utensils. So I will say, it sounds like in the Mishnah, I'd be potter. I'd be potter. Now, what do you see from there? Alma Kasav is fascinating. Tchilasa b'pshev safa ba'ones potter. I will say it's fascinating. What you see from here is as follows: that when you begin a continuum of events with negligence, but ultimately, again, the negligence results in an onus, in an extenuating circumstance, you're potter. Let me illustrate this. Should my dog be on a roof? Should my dog be on a roof? No. No, my dog shouldn't be on a roof. My goat shouldn't be on a roof because dogs jump, right? Goats jump and they can land on stuff and break it. So the act of allowing my dog or my goat on the roof is an act of pshia. I'm negligent. Now my dog is up there. But then my dog fell off and landed on the utensil. Didn't jump, it fell off. That's an onus, that's an extenuating circumstance. So you can infer from the Mishnah, so remember again, we're making an inference over here. The Mishnah tells me that if my dog or my goat was on the roof and they jumped off and landed on the utensils and broke the utensils, I'm chayiv. That's regal. Regal means it's a normative act. I'm chayiv because it's normal. I can infer from that if my dog was on the roof and fell off the roof and fell on utensils, I'd be potter. So what do you see from there? That's a case of what we call tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa ba'ones. You start with negligence, but ultimately, again, you end with extenuating circumstances. That's your potter. Tainam Yachir writes that supports this. Hakelev v'hagidi shekaftu merosh hagag. If you have a dog or a goat who jumped from the top of the roof, and they landed and they broke utensils, mishalim nezek shalim. Ultimately, again, they pay complete damages. Naflu, however, if the dog or the goat fell off the roof and landed on utensils and broke the utensils, then pturin. So both say here the Brisa says it explicitly. We were just inferring it from the Mishnah, and here the Brisa literally says it explicitly. Says the Gemara, Hani chalaman da'amar tchilasub sheva safa ba'ones pater. That's fine according to the opinion that says, that I will say, when you begin an act, ultimately again with negligence, and it results in extenuating circumstances, that's your potter. But there's another school of thought. The other school of thought says, if you're negligent, you're responsible for whatever happens. In other words, the fact that now there's an extenuating circumstance that occurred, that doesn't free you from liability. Why not? You started this. In other words, once you do something negligent that you should not be doing, obviously it's negligent, you should be doing it. Once there's damage because of an unavoidable mishap. Fascinating, right? Fascinating combination. So there's machlokes. So the Gemara says, according to the opinion that says tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa ba'ones is potter, so then our Mishnah really makes a lot of sense, and the Brisa makes a lot of sense. What about according to the opinion that says tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa ba'ones is chayiv? What do you do now? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what the case is. Kigon, the mekarvi kelin lagabi kosel. The case Rabbi say is that I allowed my dog on top of the roof, but Ruvain moved his utensils very close to the wall. Meaning what? Dechikaftsi bikfitza lo nafli alayhu. So Rabbi say it's a case ultimately again where when you jump, there's an arc, right? So in other words, if I have my dog on the roof, let me say differently. If Ruvain's utensils are flush against the wall, and my dog is on the roof, there's no pshia from the beginning, right? Why? Because at the end of the day, there's no way my dog could have broken those utensils. Because even if my dog jumps off the roof, which is normal, it would have automatically missed the utensils. So therefore, again, when my dog subsequently falls off the roof, right, and breaks the utensils, that's fully ones. There's no tchilasa b'pshia. There's no negligent beginning because I wasn't negligent. I only allowed my dog up there because at the end of the day, Ruvain's utensils were fully out of harm's way. Very interesting. So therefore, again, so what we see over here is something very interesting, that machlokes of tchilasa b'pshia v'sofo ba'ones. When you act negligently, but then ultimately an unavoidable mishap occurs, are you chayiv for the resulting damage or not? So that is a machlokes. There is a machlokes. So both say, so now the Gemara says as follows. Amrav Zim Mishnei Rava Pamim Shafilu Naflu Nami Chayiv. You know, there could be cases where sometimes even if your dog falls off, that ultimately again you would be chayiv. I will say, I just want to point out, how do we paskin? We paskin tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa ba'ones is chayiv. That's how we paskin. So if you do something negligent, and then afterwards there's an unavoidable mishap. In other words, doing something negligent means I set up negligent circumstances. I didn't do anything. In other words, I haven't caused damage, but I set up negligent circumstances, and then an unavoidable mishap occurs, which causes the damage. I am liable. So for example, in this case over here, I allowed my dog on the roof. Allowing my dog on the roof, that's negligent. That's negligent, right? Then what happens? My dog falls off the roof, right? Falls off the roof. That's ones, right? That's an extenuating, unavoidable mishap. And now my dog lands on Ruvain's utensils and breaks them. I am chayiv. I am chayiv. Which I will say is such an incredible yisod in halacha and in hashkafa. In halacha falls under the umbrella of Adam Muad Li'olam. A person is responsible for all of his actions. In hashkafa, it falls under the umbrella of Adam Muad Li'olam. A person is responsible for all of his actions. And we'll say, sometimes stuff happens in life, and we're like, not my fault. Right, as we like to say, not me, right? Not me, right? Not my fault. I had no idea. I didn't know. And sometimes I will say there are circumstances like that of ones, of just unavoidable. But I will say, but sometimes in life, when I get myself into trouble and I make significant mistakes, it's because I allowed myself to be in certain situations. I allowed myself to be with certain people. I actively made certain poor decisions. So often in life it's tchilasa b'pshia. I was negligent with how I'm living. Okay, now an ones happened, an extenuating circumstance happened afterwards. You're right. There's an ones now. But how did you get into this ones in the beginning? How did you get here? Why are you in this situation to begin with? And often it's because tchilasa b'pshia. Because I made some very poor decisions. I made some very poor life choices or lifestyle choices in the beginning, and that set me up ultimately again for the resulting ones. Shabbos we pass in both bahalacha and bahashkafa that one is chayiv. Amrav Zid Mishmei the Rava. Rav Zid's the name of Rava. Pamim shafilu naflu nami chayiv. Sometimes even if the dog falls off the roof, you could be chayiv. When I will say the Gemara says mishkachas la bekol sara'ua. Ultimately, again, when can you have it? You could have it in a rickety wall. In other words, if I allow my dog to go up on a rickety wall, so what's wrong with the rickety wall? So what do I have to be concerned on a rickety wall? That maybe if my dog goes up on it, then lamaisa again a brick is going to fall off the wall and fall down and damage. Okay, so lo nafal arche v'nafal inhu. So 1 second, but that didn't happen in this case. What happened in this case? The brick didn't fall off. What fell off? My dog. So Gemara says it's a case of tchilasa b'shev sav ba'ones lo tzricha b'kosel tsar. Then Rabbi say again, what are we talking about? A narrow wall. In a narrow wall, Rabbi say, so ultimately again, even if the dog falls off, I'm going to be chayiv. Why? Because Rabbi say that's not ones anymore. Right? In other words, if I put my dog on a narrow wall, so then again the probability is that the dog is going to fall off. So it's no longer sofa ba'ones. It's not an extenuating circumstance means I couldn't have planned for this occurrence, or it's not within the realistic possibility that this is going to occur. You put your dog on a narrow wall, you put a goat on a narrow wall, that's not even sofa ba'ones, it's going to fall off. Okay. So we'll say another case. Shedalgu mimata lamala pturin. So we'll say if you have a dog or a goat who jump mimata lamala, from the ground to the top. From the ground to the top, so the Gemara says, Pturin. The halacha is ultimately, again, they're part of Rabbos. Now take a look at Rashi. It's 3 lines up from the bottom. Milamata lemala Pturin. Minezek shalim v'chayiv v'chatzi nezek d'mishunanim. So we'll say, so apparently, it is uncommon for a dog or for a goat to jump from the ground to the top. So in other words, we're talking about a case over here where let's say again, they jump from ground level, onto top of a terrace. all right, a lower terrace, and they break utensils on the terrace. So the Gemara says, ultimately, again, you're pater. Now, pater over here means you're pater from complete damages, but chayiv in chatzi nezek. Meaning what? Meaning what? Ultimately, again, it's going to be keren. It's going to be keren. So again, that's considered to be abnormal jumping from the ground to the upper level. Okay. Fine, Peturin. Milamala lamanta, but if the dog or the goat jump from a higher level to a lower level, as we just saw before, chayovin. Ultimately, again, and they break something. I was supposed to say all these cases are breakage, right? So now if it jumps from the roof to the ground and breaks the utensils, they're chayiv. That's what we saw in the Mishnah. What is that? That's going to be called regel. Okay. Adam v'tarnagol, however, a person or a chicken, shedalgu bein milamata lemata, bein milamata lemala chayovin. But if you have a person, a man or a chicken, ultimately again, whether they jump from the ground to the roof or from the roof to the ground, they're going to be chayiv. They're both saying, even though they're grouped together, it's two different reasons. The man, because remember again, adamu ad liolam, a person is always responsible for his actions, and the chicken, ultimately again, apparently chickens jump both ways. Good to know. Right, up, down, right, down, up, and up, down. Fine. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Adam v'tarnagol, Adam inami lav arche likpotz milamat lamala chayiv de'ein ba'adam sad tamus ela behema v'tarnagol darkol l'dalig afilu milamat lamala. Okay, so interesting distinction over here. So let's go weiter. Vatanya, I suppose say top of Chaf Beis. I Vatanya, but we learn 22a, first line. Vatanya, Hakele Vagidi Shedalgu Bein Milamala Lamata, Bein Milamala Lamala, Pturin. What's that? We have a brisa. And the brisa says that if you have a dog and a goat that jump and damage, whether they're jumping from, we'll call it the roof to the ground, or from the ground to the roof, they're pater. They're pater. So what's going on over here? So we'll say, first of all, it's a double contradiction. Number one, it contradicts our Mishnah. Number two, it just contradicts the distinction we made before, that dogs and goats, it's common for them to jump from a roof to the ground, but not from the ground to the roof. So what's going on over here? Targum Papa, da'apich mepach. Da'apach mepach. Turn it around. Kalba bizrika. Da'apach mepach means they acted in an abnormal way. How so? Kalba bizkira, the gaja bisricha. So we'll say, so listen to this. So apparently, again, the dog ultimately jumped, and the goat went ahead and clawed its way up. So apparently, it's common for a dog to claw its way up, less common for it, right? And ultimately, again, so I'm sorry, right? In this case, the gedi clawed its way up, and the dog ultimately went ahead and jumped. So apparently that's considered to be abnormal behavior for both of these. All right, ihachi, amai pturin. If that's the case, then why are they pater? Also, remember, at most, when an animal does damage in an abnormal way, what do we call that? Karen. So what do you mean pater? Tushimar says, you're right. Ptura minezek shalem v'chayav bechatzi nezek. You're right. When you say pater means you're pater from complete damages, but ultimately chayiv in half damages. Okay, good. So we'll say, so let's go weiter. So next, hakelev shenatel. So we'll say, so now we're going to deal with the biscuit cold case. Remember again, we'll say, let's go back. What did the Mishnah say? My dog took a biscuit, right, with a coal on the bottom, goes over to Ruvain's field. What does it do? Eats the biscuit, places the biscuit down, eats the biscuit. The coal then ignites the field. So what's the halacha? The halacha is, I should say, the coal ignites the gadish. Gadish means like a haystack. Right? So what's the halacha? On the charara, nezek shalim. Why? Shane, right? And ultimately, again, on the field, chatzi nezek. So we're not sure exactly why they filled chatzi nezek. Let's analyze. So we'll say this is great. Itmar, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Isho mishum chatzio. So let's listen to this. We know that I have liability for my fire, right? You saw this first Mishnah in Bava Kamma, that ultimately, again, there is, if my fire does damage, there is liability for my fire. So I'll say, here's the interesting shaila to contemplate. What is the nature of the liability for my fire? Right? When my fire that I created does damage. What's the nature of that? What's the nature of my relationship with my fire? Right? We're all about relationships. Right? So what is the relationship that I have with my fire? Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, my fire is like my arrow. right? Just like I will say, if I shoot an arrow and that injures or damages something, that arrow is misyaches, it's connected to me because it comes from my force. So just like my arrow is my force, my fire is considered to be like my arrow, my force as well. Reish Lakish says, no, my fire is like my property. Essentially, my fire is like my ox. Just like if my ox does damage, I'm responsible. So if my fire does damage, I'm responsible. We'll say fascinating, right? Absolutely fascinating. So look at Rashi. Rashi says Mishum Chatzio Chayvo Hakasov Di'ihu Ka'avid Davi Kizorik Chetz. So again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, when I ignite my fire and it gets out of my control, that's like shooting an arrow. My power, my koach. And again, Reish Lakish, it's like my shar. Mishum Amon Rashi says Kishoro Uboro. Good. So let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Reish Lakish. My Tzavos says obviously this is all going to have an impact in terms of how you weigh liability of the coal that ignited the haystack in this case. We're going to have to see how all of this plays out. So the Gemara says as follows. Here we go. Reish Lakish, my time alone, Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish, why don't you look Rabbi Yochanan? Reish Lakish holds that your fire is like your ox, like your mammon. Why doesn't he look Rabbi Yochanan that it's like your chetz? Amar locho chatzio mikocho ka'azli. It's very simple. We'll say when I shoot an arrow, the damaging power of that arrow is a direct result of my koach. Right? I pull the bow back further, I pull it back less. I control that literally it's direct result of my power. So the Gemara says, hi, lo mikocho kazel. A fire has a mind of its own, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? Meaning, in other words, yes, I create the fire, but in terms of where the fire goes, how the fire damages the intent, that I'm not controlling that. That doesn't have to do with my koach. That's why Reish Lakish is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, my time Amar Reish Lakish. Why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan hold like Reish Lakish? Amar, so the Gemara says, Amar lecha, mamona ispe memasha. You know, my mammon, my property, has substance, right? My ox, my goat, my dog, right? They have substance. They have mamashas to it. There's physicality to it. Less mashasha. Fire doesn't have physicality to it, right? Doesn't have something that you can put your arms around. Okay. So that's right. Neither of them go ahead and agree with each other. Fine. So we'll say, so now remember, why is this important? We haven't really gotten into an in-depth discussion about Eish yet, right? We still have to Amirat Hashem. We haven't yet. So Lamaisa, the Gemara says, so now the reason why this is important is because we're going to plug it into our Mishnah. Here we go. Tanan. Hakelev shenat al charara. So remember again, what did our Mishnah say? My dog took a biscuit. On the bottom of the biscuit, a coal was attached to it. Put it down on the haystack. Chayiv nezek shalim for the biscuit and chatzi nezek for the damage. So let's analyze. So bishlam lemandamar ishim ishim chatzio. So we'll say, I understand now, according to the opinion, i.e. Rabbi Yochanan, who says that Eish is my arrow. So now we'll say, so now chatzio de kelevhu. So we'll say, so now I understand, because therefore the fire or the coal, the resulting fire after the dog puts down the biscuit. After the dog puts down the biscuit, so the fire is considered to be the arrow of the dog. Or in other words, what do we call it? It's called tzroros. It's called tzroros, right? So in other words, the fire is considered to be the tzroros of the dog, the koach of the dog. Remember again, what's tzroros? What's tzroros? Tzroros ultimately, again, is indirect damage caused by the direct force of the animal. Well, that would be this case. Here again, the dog picked up the biscuit with the coal, put down the biscuit with the coal. That again ignited everything. That would be called tzroros. So again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that fire is like your arrow, this would be a case of the arrow of the dog, which we also call tzroros. That's why the Mishnah says, chayiv chatzi nezek, half damages for any damages caused by the fire. Elamandamar ishim ishim mamono. But if you hold that fire, ultimately again is the mammon of the owner, high eish lab mamon of the bal kelefu. So we'll say, so remember again, obviously the dog can't own anything, and lemais again, it's not my fire. It's not my fire, right? It's not my coal. The dog didn't take my biscuit. The dog took someone else's biscuit, right? So lemais again, then the fire doesn't really belong to anyone per se. So lemais again, I'm not going to be chayiv for that. In other words, even though my dog put it there, I'm not going to be responsible for that. The Gemara says, look at Rashi, La mamona de bal kelefu ela de bal charara. They both say, now you could maybe the owner of the field has a taina against the owner of the biscuit, right? Because the mice say it's his coal, but as I, the owner of the dog, it's not my coal. It's not my coal. I was supposed to hear what's happening over here. If you hold that fire is mishum chitziyov, is like your koach, is like your arrow, then the mice, when my dog puts the biscuit with the coal down on Ruvain's field, then I'm going to be responsible, because essentially it's the tzroros, it's the koach of my animal, which is the tzroros of my animal. I'm going to be chayiv chatzin nezek. But if you hold that fire is mamon, is my property, the mice said it's not my fire. It's not my fire. It's not my coal. It's not my fire. So if it's not my fire, I don't have any liability for it. Incredible. Amar l'cha Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish will say, no. What's the case over here? So I'll say the case over here. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, da'aji aduye shezarko. Interesting. The case over here is the dog threw the biscuit, ate the biscuit, and then threw it onto the godish, onto the haystack. So what's the pshat? So let's listen to this. So ultimately, again, for the charara, for the consumption of the biscuit, you're going to pay full damages, which makes sense, because the mice, again, it is shame. And ultimately, again, for the place of the coal, that you're going to have to pay half damages. V'agodesh kula pater. So I'll say this is so fascinating. So Reish Lakish is going to divide this into three parts. There's three pieces over here. There's the biscuit, there's the area where the biscuit landed and the damage that occurred, and then there's the burning of the rest of the field. So Reish Lakish will say like this. We're talking about a case where the dog tossed the biscuit. So for the biscuit itself, chayiv nezek shalim, because again it's going to be shame. For the area where the biscuit falls, you're going to be chayiv, right? You're going to be chayiv chatzi nezek. Why Rabbi say, what is that? Ultimately, again, that's going to be tzroros. But ultimately, again, for the rest of the field, you're going to be pater. Why? Because Reish Lakish holds Eisha Mishum Mamono. Eish is your property, and over here again, this property is not this fire is not the property of the owner of the dog. So he subdivides it into three parts. Look at Rashi. Va'agadish kulei pater the Eisha Mishum Mamono v'hailav Mamonahu utzroros leka lemeimar dahab b'makom gachalis ve'ilach dalka ish me'elav. Shabbos says, so this is fascinating. So according to Reish Lakish, we have to set up the case is a case where the dog threw the biscuit, so the biscuit is going to be chayiv nezek shalim for shame. Where the biscuit lands, you're going to be chayiv for damages because of tzroros. But then the subsequent fire that spreads and destroys, there's no liability for the owner of the dog on that. Why? Because Eisha Mishum Mamono, ultimately again, fire is the mamon, is the property of the owner. And again, here the owner of the dog doesn't own the fire, not going to be chayiv for subsequent damages. Very interesting. That's how Reish Lakish will set up the case. For Rabbi Yochanan would say da'ancha anuche. Rabbi Yochanan says no, that's not the case. The case is where the dog placed the biscuit down. And therefore what? Al charara va'al makom gacheles mishalim nezek shalim. It's interesting enough, Rabbi say, on the biscuit and on the place that you place down the biscuit, the damage established right there. Ultimately, again, you'll have to pay nezek shalim, right? Why? Because Rabbi say again that is going to be shame. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, interestingly enough, it is going to be regel. Look at Rashi's moment. Rabbi Yochanan, Damar Isha Mishum Chatz Yomokim La B'Da'anchei Ki Orchei Ta'Charar Nezek Shalem D'Shenu Va'Amakom Gacheles Nezek Shalem D'Orcheihu U'Bi'adayim Avad. So interestingly enough, for the consumption of the biscuit, Shane, for the placement of the biscuit down, that is an activity of daily living, that the animal places its food down. So that is damages done through activities of daily living. What do we call that? Regel. We call that regel. So there's going to be, therefore again, for the damage done in the area of the placement, it's going to be regel. For the rest of the damage is done, that's called tzroros. And therefore you'll pay half damages for the rest of the field. Incredible, I will say. So I just want to point out just how this plays out. So I will say, so now watch how this machlokes plays out very quickly. So again, according to Reish Lakish who holds Isho Mishum Mamono, that your Eish is your property. So the way he sets up the case is the dog chucked through the charara, and the charara landed. So on the biscuit, you're chayiv nezek shalem because ultimately it's shein. The area where it landed, you're chayiv chatzi nezek because it's sroros, and then the rest of the damage, you're pater. Why? Because it's not, the fire doesn't belong to you, the owner of the dog, and therefore you're going to be pater. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the case is where you placed down the biscuit, the dog placed down the biscuit on the area of the gadish. So therefore, again, for consumption of the charara, ultimately chayiv nezek shalem shein. For the area where you placed it down and it damaged, that's damaging activities of daily living, that's regel. And then ultimately, again, for the rest of the field, you will be chayiv chatzi nezek. Why? Because of sroros. Fascinating. And their entire interpretation of the Mishnah is based on how they view the damaging force of Eish. Is Eish considered to be your direct koach? Eish shum mishum chetzio, that's going to be Rabbi Yochanan. Or is Eish ultimately, again, a result, is your mammon, is considered to be your property, like your ox? That's Reish Lakish. Again, I will say we're not going to resolve that machlokes now because we're going to deal with that later on. But interesting to see how that shapes their interpretation of the Mishnah. Incredible. Tashma. But some interesting cases over here. Gamaltan Pishtan, my camel is holding flax. Va'avar b'shos harabim, now my camel is holding flax, going through shosarabim. Nichnesa Pishtan l'socha achanas v'dalgo b'neiro shel chemini. So let's say my flax extends into the store, right? Reuven has a store, and extends into his store. Reuven has a candle lit in his store. The candle ignites the flax, v'hidlik es abir, and burns down the store. What's the halacha? Bal Kamma chayiv. In that case, I'm chayiv. Now, why am I chayiv, Bosai? Right? Negligent loading. Negligent loading. In other words, what am I doing loading my animal in a way in which the flax could extend into a store? Right? So I'm chayiv for that. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, this is what I say, incredible. B'ner Chanukah, pater. However, again, I will say, if, it's so beautiful, no? So beautiful. If my ner Chanukah, right, when's Chanukah? Chanukah is two weeks from yesterday. 2 weeks from last night. 2 weeks from last night is the first Ner, Mir Hashem. So we'll say, so B'ner Chanukah pater. Now we'll say what this means is, if my camel's walking through the Shorabim, and ultimately again, the load is ignited, ultimately again, through the Ner Chanukah, then ultimately again, I'll be pater. Okay, so we'll see that, because halacha l'maisa, there's a mitzvah to place the Ner Chanukah outside. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says as follows. I skipped a line. Did I skip a line? Yeah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'ner Chanukah pater. Fine. So Bishlam Laman Damer. So let's analyze this a little bit. Bishlam Laman Damer Ishu Mishum Chatzio. So I understand if you hold that Lamaisa again, fire is your koach, is your arrow. Chatzyav de Gamahu. Then I will say makes sense. Then Lamaisa again in the case where halacha Lamaisa, the load of my camel extended into the store, caused the store to ignite, right? Then again, that's my camel's arrow. I understand that. But if you hold Eshu Mishum Mamono, Hai Esh Lav Mamono de Bal Gamalhu. The fire doesn't belong to the owner of the camel. Right? I was about to say, in this case over here, remember again, whose fire was it? The store owner's fire. If it's the store owner's fire, then why am I liable? The Gemara says, so we'll say, interestingly enough, the case over here is, Rashi says, Memesachseches es kalabira kula. Rashi says, Shagamel over bifnei kalabira, umisachsecho deha vadai have kulo kimokom gacheles. Aval ba'alma she'ish halachas. So the case over here is where the camel essentially goes ahead, and the camel itself spans the entire store. So therefore, again, what's happening over here is the camel itself is directly igniting everything. So because it's directly igniting, it's not really Isha Mishum Mamono. Here again, the camel is directly involved in the damage. To which the Gemara says, Ihachi, if that's the case, Ema Seifa, Im Heniach Chen V'Ninero Mibachotz Chen V'Nichayev. Yet there was a son the Seifa, that if the shopkeeper put the fire outside the store, that the Chen V'Ni is Chayiv. If that's the case, V'Bim Mesach Seches Am Mai Chayiv. So the Gemara says, B'Sha'amda, where the animal is standing still. To which the Gemara says, Amda v'sachsecha, so that means the animal stood still and kind of simultaneously ignited everything. And I was about to say, that's more like a case where the animal is directly damaging. Kol shekim the cheveni pater, all the more so that the cheveni should be pater, ubal gamal chayiv, and the owner of the camel should be chayiv. Amrafuna bar manuach, mishvei Rav Ika, sorry, hagam asking, what's the case? Kigon sha'amda lahatil memeha. This is interesting. About say the case over here is where what? The animal stood still to relieve itself. In other words, apparently animals stand still to relieve themselves. They don't walk and take care of their needs. So Rashi says there, therefore I will say again, it's a case ultimately again where there's an ones, right? Because the animal stood still, but the animal kind of simultaneously ignited everything. I just want to point out what's happening over here. Even Reish Lakish, who holds that normally your Eish is your mammon, is your property, and also the problem is, if Eish is your mammon, an animal can't have mammon, right? An animal could have an arrow. In other words, an animal could cause a secondary force. That's Sroros. An animal can't have mammon. So therefore, if Eisho is Mishum mammon, then ultimately, again, you're going to have a hard time creating liability for Aish through an animal, right? You hear that? Because mama means property. Property means you have to have a human being who's involved. An animal can't really be involved with that. What Reish Lakish is doing is the case of Sachsecha, is essentially where an animal is right directly involved in the entire damage, in which case it's not really secondary damage, but it's more like what? Direct damage. Okay, so that's how the Gemara is setting this up. We're going to say Amabase. So Reisha, in the first case, right? In the first case, which was talking about the situation where the fire itself is inside of the store. Reisha bal gamal chayiv. So we'll say case number one is where, remember again, my camel is walking through a Shusarabim and has flax, and the flax extended into Ruvain's store, caught on Ruvain's candle, and ignited the store. In that case, who's chayiv? I, the owner of the camel, am chayiv. Why? The Gemara says, because we'll say, obviously, I overloaded the animal. In other words, when loading your animal, Rabosai, sometimes, it's interesting. We think that when loading your animal, what do you have to be concerned about? How much could the animal handle? While that's true, what you also have to be concerned about is your animal is going to be traveling through Sarabim. Sometimes it's maybe more constricted areas, or there are other animals, or there are stores, and you can't overload your animal in a way that could result in damage. So in case number one, where my flax, the load was, I guess, like so wide that it extended into someone's storefront, then the Maisa, I, the owner of the animal, have the liability for that. Seifa, in the Seifa case of Bosai, which is where what? Seifa is where Ruvain, the store owner, left the candle outside. Then in that case, Seifa, the storekeeper is going to be chayiv. Why? He should not have gone ahead and kept the candle outside. Fine, so we'll say, so those are the cases. That's it, right? So halacha l'maisa, and I will say, the great part, we're going to see this case, the Ner Chanukah case, I will say, of course, is going to be the exception to this rule. Why? So generally, we have two essential rules, right? Rule number one is, if the load on your animal extends into a shop, into a store, and as a result does damage, you, the owner of the animal, have overloaded your chayiv. Chenveni, shopkeeper, I will say, obviously you're talking about stores that abat or are in the Rosh Hashanah. So shopkeeper, you leave a fire outside, and as a result, again, the load is ignited and burns down the store, it does damage. You, the shopkeeper, achayiv, you don't leave fire outside your store, right? The exception to that rule is going to be where? Ner Chanukah. Because Ner Chanukah, ultimately, again, there is a mitzvah to place Ner Chanukah outside. So Mir Hashem, we'll see how to deal with that case. Next, now both say, again, just understand why are we doing all this. Remember, all of this is part of our fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, namely about how to deal with Eish. What is Eish? Is Eish considered to be my arrow, my koach, or is Eish considered to be my mammon, my property? I both say you see tremendous nafkamina. It's going to be the nafkamina. The nafkamina will be liability for Eish when an animal is involved. That's really what it comes down to, right? If you hold that if your fire is your arrow, then you could have Eish liability even through Eish damage caused by an animal, because an animal could have an arrow. What do we call the arrow of an animal? What do we call that? Sroros. Good. However, if you hold that Eish liability is mammon, is property, an animal doesn't have property. Right? And therefore, again, it's going to be difficult to kind of create liability in cases of eish damage caused by animals. Again, so just kind of keep this in mind. Obviously, we're going to delve fully into the eish sugi in just a bit. Let's go back to Tashma. Hamadlikes Hagadish. Interesting case here. I go ahead and I ignite a field. V'haya gedi kafaslo. And I will say, let's say there was a tied up kid. A goat, right? A goat in the field. Ve'eved samochlo, and there was an eved, right? Bless you, an eved kinani that was next to the field. And what happened? V'nisraf imo chayiv, and the goat is incinerated. And let's say the eved dies. I'm putter, right? I'm sorry, chayiv. Ve'eved samochlo, v'nisraf imo chayiv. They both say now again. What am I chayiv on? Rashi says I'm chayiv on the gedi. I'm chayiv for the goat that was killed, and I'm also chayiv for the field, Vagadish, right? But ultimately, I will say, what am I not chayiv for? I'm not chayiv for the eved. Why am I not chayiv for the eved? He should have run away. We'll say, so look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi said, "V'nisraf imo chayiv ha'agdi." I'm chayiv for the goat because it was tied up; it couldn't run away. I'm chayiv for the field. Lefi she'ein lo din misa b'shvil ha'eved shaylo livrach. The eved should have run away. We'll say, what a tremendous Musar Haskell. When you see danger, what's the halacha? Run. We'll say, when you see danger, what's the hashkafa? Run. We'll say it's the same thing as we saw before. In life, we know when I'm about to encounter or I'm in the midst of dangerous circumstances. We're talking about spiritually dangerous circumstances. Physically dangerous circumstances, we all know to run. I'll say, but when it comes to spiritually dangerous situations, sometimes we think that we could just stay still and nothing is going to happen. I'll say, when you see spiritual danger approaching, the most important thing, like Rashi says, is shahaya lo livroach. Run away. Don't allow yourself to be in spiritually compromised situations. Okay, next case. Eved kafoslo ugedi samochlo v'nisraf imo pater. What happens if in the field there's a bound eved, right? The eved kinani is bound in the field, and a gedi and a goat that's next to the field, and I burn down the field, and now the eved obviously is killed, and the gedi is also killed. What's the halacha? Pater. Now watch this. What does it mean, pater? Pater Rosa means I'm pater on the field, and I'm pater ultimately on the kid, on the gedi, on the goat. Why? Because Rabbi say there's capital liability for killing the eved. Now remember again, Rabbi say in any case where there is dual liability, capital liability and financial liability, we have a concept. What's the concept? Kimle b'derabamine. Ultimately, again, was essentially because you're liable to a death penalty, so essentially we seize the more severe penalty, and you are exempted on subsequent penalties. So anytime you're chayiv, a capital punishment, and along with that also capital financial liability. The financial liability is set aside, and ultimately capital liability remains. So in this case, when I burned down a field and there was a tied up eved in there, right? And let's say, so I killed the eved, I destroyed the field, and I also killed the goat. So again, I'm chayiv for killing the eved, capital liability, and therefore exempted from all the financial liability. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, eved kafos ugedi samachov v'nisrael agedi v'agadish tekimle. Okay, that's it. Next. So let's analyze. So I understand if you hold that ultimately again fire is my arrow. So now we're talking about case number 2. So I understand now fire is my arrow. I understand why I am liable for igniting the field and killing the eved. And remember again, it's an eved who's tied up, so he can't run anywhere. So I understand why I'm liable for that. I both say no different. If I take an arrow and I shoot it and I kill someone, what's the halacha? Chas v'shalom. I'm chayiv. So therefore, again, if you hold that fire is my arrow, when I ignite a field and there is a bound eved in there and he dies as a result of my fire, I'm liable. El man damer ishu mishum mamono amai. Says, "Amai pater." Amai pater. Ilu katal ture avda hachanami delom chayiv. So I'll say so again, but I don't understand. If isho is mishum mamono, if my fire ultimately again is what? If my fire is going to go ahead, if my fire is my mammon, right? If my fire is my property, then I will say, if my property kills someone, am I chayiv? Am I chayiv? I'm chayiv financially, right? But I'm not chayiv in the capital case. So we'll say it's really a double question. It's a question on both cases, because in case number one, there should be liability, and in case number two, ultimately, again, there should be financial liability and no capital liability. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi for just a moment. Im katal turei avdi hakaram lo mechayev mamon haksiv kesef shlosha. So we'll say, see here the shaila. So again, if you hold ishum mishum chetzav, if fire is my arrow, so then I should be. So then I understand why I'm liable in case number two, right? But again, lemaisa, if you hold ishum mishum mamono, that ultimately again my fire is my mamon, my property. Then I will say it's a kash on both cases. Then number one, I should be chayiv in case number one, and ultimately again there should be no capital liability in case number two. What's the case? Kishehitzis begufo shel eved. Okay, interesting. What's the case? The case over here is where I ignited the actual body of the eved. Okay, an extreme case, right? So in other words, I'm supposed to say this is for illustration purposes only, right? I'm igniting. Now I'll say, so when I ignite the body of the eved, then I'll say, even if you hold isho mishum mamono, right? You're still going to be chayiv capital, right? You're still chayiv death penalty. Why? Because there you're causing direct damage. It's similar to what we said before about misach seches, right? The same way that where the camel was causing direct damage. So I will say it's interesting. According to Rish Lakish will say there are obviously cases of eish where it is like your arrow. That's when you would be, now this is even more than your arrow, this is you directly causing damage. So Rish Lakish will say the case where you're chayiv, capital liability for killing the eved with fire would be when you directly ignited the eved. Obviously an extreme case to illustrate the point. If that's the case, so we'll say if that's the case, then that's obvious, right? What else is there to say? So this is interesting. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about a case over here, where ultimately in this situation, the goat belonged to one person and the eved belonged to a different person. I will say, isn't this interesting? So the gedi belonged to one person, the eved belonged to a different person. So the Gemara says, now what does that mean? The Gemara says, I might have thought as follows. I might have thought that the concept of kimle b'dirabimine only applies when both things belong to the same person, right? So for example, I go ahead and I burn down Ruvain's field and kill his eved. So now that there's dual liability to Ruvain, Kimle b'dirabimine says, capital liability sets aside financial liability. But maybe if the capital liability, the eved belongs to one person, the field belongs to a second person, maybe we don't say kimle b'dirabimine, right? Maybe again, since it's two different liabilities to two different people, maybe I'm chayiv. Both kamash malon, no. Good. Tashma. But say if I give a fire over in the hand of a cheresh, shota, and a katan, ultimately again, so remember again, these are all people who lack das. So let's say I go ahead and I give over the fire to one of these people. What's the halacha? Pater midine adam v'chayiv b'dine shamayim. Ultimately, again, I will say I am pater b'dine adam. Ultimately, again, I'm exempt in the Beis Din, but ultimately I'm chayiv in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All right. So Bishlam Laman. So we'll say, let's analyze this. So Bishlam Laman the Amar Ishu Mishum Chesyav the Cherishu. So we'll say, I understand this because if you hold that Ish is my arrow, then when I give over the fire to the Cherishot of a cotton, whose arrow is it? It's their arrow. And obviously, again, I'm not liable for what they do with their arrow. Rather, the Gemara says, however, the Elaman do Amar Ishu Mishum Mamono, but if you hold that ultimately, again, Ish is my property, Ish is my mamon, then I will say, Ilu Masar Shoro, Lechere Shot of a cotton, Hachanami Dol Mechayiv. We'll say, what happens if I gave over my ox to a Chere Shot of a cotton? What would happen in that situation? I'd be chayiv, because it's my property that's doing damage. So if my fire is my property, there should be liability in this case as well. Hachanami Dol Mechayiv. I'd certainly be chayiv. Ha'itmarala amrei shlakish mishvei dechizkiya lo shana ela kishemasalo gacheles veliba. So we'll say inachinami. When are you exempt for a fire? That's if you went ahead and you gave the cherishot of a cotton a coal, and then they fanned the coal, because then ultimately again it's their liability. Aval masalo shal heves chayiv. But ultimately again, if you gave them an actual flame, then they would be chayiv, right? My timer. What's the reason? Bari hezeka. ultimately, again, because halacha l'maisa, they are creating direct damage. Bar Zeka means you're giving them something that is an actively damaging force. Rabbi Yochanan will say, afilu shal heves pater, even if you give them a flame, it's going to be pater. Why? Kasaret savsad decherish kagarim. Halacha l'maisa, it's the grasp of the cherish that's causing the damage. In other words, even with a flame by itself doesn't cause damage. It still requires human intervention. Lo mechayiv ad demasar like gavza silsa ushraga. Ultimately, again, you won't be chayiv until you give them literally, again, gavza silsa ushraga means literally dry wood, small little splinters of wood, and ultimately, again, a fire itself. That is going to be ultimately, again, what causes liability. So we'll stop over here for today, and we're going to pick up in Miras Hashem tomorrow. Again, continuing the same machlokes. Suppose that all of this is the same machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What is the nature of the liability of fire? Is fire considered to be your arrow, your koach, or is fire considered to be your property, your mammon? We'll see all of the nafkaminas. And Miras Hashem will be continued tomorrow. Say shkoyach. All right, Chevra on Zoom, good Shabbos, everyone. Wow, this is Mamish now, all Eretz Yisrael, Chevra. What a schos, Baruch Hashem. Good Shabbos, everyone.